August 16, 1966. Rashid Air Base, Baghdad, Iraq. Iraqi Air Force Captain Munir Redfa walked across the tarmac toward his assigned MiG-21 F-13 fighter. Soviet military advisors watched from the operations building, noting another routine training sortie for the Iraqi pilots under their supervision. The flight plan indicated a standard combat maneuvers exercise, nothing unusual, nothing that would raise suspicion. Redfa climbed into the cockpit, ran through his pre-flight checklist, and signaled ground crew to remove the wheel chocks. The Tumansky R-11 turbojet engine wound up to full power as Redfa advanced the throttle and began his takeoff roll. What Soviet advisors didn't know was that Munir Redfa would never return to Rashid Air Base. The training flight was a cover for Operation Diamond, a joint CIA and Israeli Mossad intelligence operation that had taken 3 years to plan and execute. Within 2 hours, the MiG-21 fighter that represented the Soviet Union's most advanced frontline aircraft would be sitting on an Israeli runway, delivered intact with full documentation by a pilot who had decided that his future lay with the West rather than the Soviet-aligned regime he served. Moscow had no idea that one of their most closely guarded military secrets was about to fall into American hands. For the Soviet Union, the MiG-21 represented their answer to American air superiority claims. Designated fishbed by NATO intelligence, the MiG-21 had entered frontline service in 1960 as the Soviet Air Force's primary interceptor and air superiority fighter. By 1966, the aircraft had been exported to 15 nations including North Vietnam, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The MiG-21 specifications impressed Western intelligence analysts who had to rely on distant photographs and pilot reports rather than hands-on examination. The fighter could reach speeds exceeding Mach 2 at high altitude. Its service ceiling of 57,000 feet put it among the highest flying combat aircraft in the world. Armed with R-3S infrared-guided missiles and a twin-barrel 23mm cannon, the MiG-21 packed firepower that had proven deadly against American aircraft over North Vietnam. Soviet propaganda declared the MiG-21 superior to anything Western air forces could field, and Western intelligence had no way to definitively disprove those claims because no MiG-21 had ever fallen into NATO hands intact. American pilots who had encountered MiG-21s in combat over Vietnam reported a fast, maneuverable opponent that could engage at long range with missiles, then close for cannon attacks if missiles missed. Between 1965 and 1966, North Vietnamese MiG-21s had shot down several American F-4 Phantoms, proving that Soviet fighters could challenge American technological superiority. The kills generated concern at the Pentagon. If North Vietnamese pilots, many with limited training, could shoot down American aircraft using MiG-21s, what would happen in a full-scale conflict against Soviet pilots flying the same aircraft? Soviet confidence in the MiG-21's security rested on strict export controls that the Kremlin believed made defection or capture impossible. The Soviet Union never sold MiG-21s to non-aligned nations. Every export included Soviet military advisors who maintained constant presence at bases where MiG-21s operated. Export versions like the MiG-21 F-13 were slightly downgraded from Soviet Air Force standards, less sophisticated avionics, simplified weapons systems, but still represented frontline capability that Western intelligence desperately wanted to examine. Soviet security protocols assumed that no pilot would defect with such a valuable aircraft. The consequences for a pilot's family would be severe. The political repercussions for the government that lost a MiG-21 would be devastating. Soviet military planners considered the MiG-21's secrets as safe as any classified technology could be in a world where espionage was constant, but physical capture of intact modern aircraft was virtually impossible. They were wrong. The operation that would prove Soviet security assumptions catastrophically inadequate began in 1963 when Israeli Mossad intelligence officers identified a potential vulnerability in Iraq's Air Force. Captain Munir Redfa was a Christian in a Muslim-majority military. He faced systematic discrimination that limited his career advancement despite being one of Iraq's most skilled pilots. Redfa's frustration with his treatment made him a potential recruitment target. someone who might be convinced that his talents would be better appreciated elsewhere. Mossad made contact through a relative living in Europe. The initial conversations focused not on espionage, but on Redfa's personal grievances and his concerns about his family's future in Iraq. Mossad officers understood that successful recruitment required addressing the target's motivations rather than simply offering money. Redfa's motivations were personal safety for his family, escape from discrimination, and the promise of Israeli citizenship where his skills would be valued rather than dismissed because of his religion. The CIA became involved when Mossad informed American intelligence that they had a potential operation to acquire a MiG-21. The Pentagon needed that aircraft desperately. American pilots were dying over Vietnam, facing an opponent they couldn't adequately study. The CIA committed support to what Mossad designated Operation Diamond, the acquisition of Iraq's most advanced Soviet fighter through defection rather than theft. The operational challenge was extraordinary. Redfa wouldn't defect without ensuring his family's safety. Iraqi security services watched the families of Air Force pilots closely, alert for any signs of contact with foreign intelligence. Extracting Redfa's family from Iraq without alerting authorities required patience, planning, and resources that only a sophisticated intelligence service could provide. Mossad executed the family extraction in July 1966, moving Redfa's wife and children out of Iraq through a series of carefully orchestrated steps that Iraqi security never detected. With his family safe, Redfa committed to the second phase of Operation Diamond. He would fly his assigned MiG-21 to Israel during what appeared to be a routine training mission. The plan required precise execution. Redfa would need to descend to low altitude immediately after takeoff to evade Iraqi radar coverage. He would fly west toward the Jordanian border, then turn south toward Israel before Iraqi air defenses could scramble interceptors. Israeli Air Force F-4 Phantoms would meet him at the border to escort him to Hatzor Air Base, where Israeli intelligence and American technical experts would be waiting. On August 16, 1966, every element of the plan executed perfectly. Redfa lifted off from Rashid Air Base, climbed briefly to establish his flight pattern on Iraqi radar, then descended rapidly to terrain following altitude. The MiG-21's radar signature disappeared from Iraqi air traffic control screens. Ground controllers assumed he was conducting low-altitude training, a common exercise that didn't raise immediate alarm. By the time Iraqi air defense realized they had lost contact with one of their aircraft, Redfa was crossing into Jordanian airspace at 500 feet altitude, his MiG-21 hugging the terrain below radar coverage. Israeli F-4 Phantoms intercepted Redfa 20 miles from the Israeli border. The American-built fighters formed up on either side of the Soviet-built MiG-21 in an image that symbolized the intelligence coup about to be realized. Israeli air traffic controllers guided Redfa to Hatzor Air Base, where security personnel had cleared the facility of unnecessary observers. The MiG-21 touched down on Israeli concrete at 10:45 a.m. local time. Soviet advisors in Baghdad were still waiting for Redfa to return from his training flight. Iraqi Air Force commanders initiated search operations when Redfa failed to return by his scheduled arrival time. They assumed a crash, mechanical failure, or pilot error that had caused the MiG-21 to go down in Iraqi territory. Search parties combed the desert for 3 days looking for wreckage that didn't exist. Iraqi officials never suspected defection. The possibility that a pilot would steal one of their most valuable aircraft seemed too audacious to consider seriously. Soviet advisors assured Iraqi commanders that comprehensive security protocols made defection impossible. They were learning otherwise. Israeli intelligence began debriefing Redfa immediately. He provided technical manuals he had smuggled out in preparation for the defection. He explained Soviet tactics as taught to Iraqi pilots by Soviet instructors. He detailed the MiG-21's strengths, and more importantly, its weaknesses, the limitations that Soviet propaganda never mentioned, but that pilots who flew the aircraft understood intimately. The intelligence Redfa provided would have been valuable on its own. Combined with the actual aircraft sitting in an Israeli hangar, It represented an intelligence windfall beyond anything the CIA had achieved through years of satellite reconnaissance and electronic intercepts. The MiG-21 was transported to the United States within weeks of the defection. The aircraft arrived at Groom Lake, Nevada, the remote testing facility known popularly as Area 51. USAF and Navy test pilots were assembled for what would be designated the Have Donut program, a classified testing operation that would reveal every performance characteristic and tactical limitation of the Soviet Union's frontline fighter. Between 1966 and 1968, American pilots flew hundreds of hours in the captured MiG-21, pushing the aircraft through its complete flight envelope and documenting capabilities that Soviet export customers had never been fully informed about. The testing revealed that Soviet propaganda claims significantly overstated the MiG-21's capabilities. Yes, the fighter was fast at high altitude. Mach 2 performance was real. But that speed came at severe cost in fuel consumption. The MiG-21's combat radius when flying at maximum performance was limited to approximately 45 minutes. A dogfight that extended beyond that time frame forced the MiG-21 to break off engagement and return to base or risk running out of fuel. American F-4 Phantoms, while slower at maximum speed, carried significantly more fuel and could remain in combat for extended periods. Tactics that forced MiG-21 pilots into prolonged engagements exploited this fundamental weakness. Low-altitude performance testing exposed another critical vulnerability. The MiG-21's delta wing design optimized the aircraft for high-speed, high-altitude interception. At low altitude and slower speeds, the wing configuration produced poor turning radius. American F-4 Phantoms could outturn MiG-21s in low-altitude combat, a devastating discovery given that most dogfights over Vietnam occurred below 20,000 feet, where both aircraft operated at speeds well below Mach 2. Forcing a MiG-21 into a turning fight at low altitude gave American pilots a decisive advantage that Soviet design hadn't anticipated. Weapons testing revealed perhaps the most exploitable weakness. The R-3S infrared-guided missile that armed most export MiG-21s was inferior to the American AIM-9 Sidewinder in critical ways. The R-3S had a narrower seeker cone, the angular field of view within which the missile could detect and lock onto a target's heat signature. American pilots learned that aggressive maneuvering could break R-3S lock more easily than Sidewinder lock. The Soviet missile also lost track more frequently when targets flew into clouds or executed hard turns that briefly masked the target's heat signature. The AIM-9, while not perfect, maintained lock more reliably under combat conditions. American test pilots developed specific tactics to exploit each weakness. Force MiG-21s into low-altitude engagements where American aircraft held turning advantage. Extend fights beyond 45 minutes to force MiG-21s to disengage due to fuel limitations. Execute aggressive defensive maneuvers when MiG-21s launched R-3S missiles, exploiting the weapon's tendency to lose lock. These tactics weren't theoretical recommendations. They were battle-tested procedures developed by flying against an actual MiG-21 under controlled conditions, where American pilots could experiment without the consequences of miscalculation, meaning death. The Have Donut program evolved into ongoing aggressor training, where F-4 crews deployed to Groom Lake to practice air combat maneuvering against the MiG-21. Pilots who had been shot down over Vietnam because they didn't understand MiG-21 capabilities now trained against the actual aircraft, learning its radar signature, its flight characteristics, its limitations. The training dramatically improved American combat effectiveness. Pilots who completed aggressor training reported feeling prepared for MiG-21 encounters in ways that previous training against American aircraft could never achieve. The intelligence was shared with NATO allies and with the Israeli Air Force, which had made Operation Diamond possible. Israeli pilots received detailed briefings on the MiG-21's weaknesses, information that would prove decisive during the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israeli fighters faced Egyptian and Syrian MiG-21s. The lopsided kill ratios that Israeli pilots achieved against Arab air forces owed much to the knowledge gained from the captured aircraft. Egyptian and Syrian pilots flew MiG-21s according to Soviet doctrine that assumed certain advantages. Israeli pilots fought those same MiG-21s knowing exactly which advantages were real and which were propaganda. The impact on Vietnam combat operations was immediate and measurable. Beginning in 1968, American F-4 Phantom kill ratios against North Vietnamese MiG-21s shifted decisively in American favor. Pilots who had previously treated the MiG-21 as a dangerous unknown now engaged Soviet fighters with confidence based on knowledge of specific vulnerabilities. The psychological advantage was as important as the tactical knowledge. American aircrews understood that they were fighting an opponent whose capabilities had been thoroughly studied and whose limitations could be exploited through proper tactics. Soviet military intelligence didn't immediately realize that a MiG-21 had been compromised. Throughout late 1966 and early 1967, Soviet advisors in various nations continued operating under the assumption that MiG-21 secrets remained secure. The first hints that something was wrong appeared during the Six-Day War in June 1967. Israeli pilots demonstrated detailed knowledge of MiG-21 performance characteristics that seemed impossible to acquire without hands-on access to the aircraft. Israeli tactics exploited specific weaknesses that Soviet pilots recognized as accurate assessments of the MiG-21's limitations. Soviet intelligence began investigating how Israel had acquired such detailed knowledge. The investigation eventually traced back to Operation Diamond and Munir Redfa's defection. By 1968, Soviet military leadership understood that their most advanced export fighter had been comprehensively compromised. One of their aircraft had been tested by American pilots for 2 years. Every weakness had been documented. Tactics to exploit those weaknesses had been developed and disseminated throughout NATO air forces. The security failure was complete. The Soviet response was multifaceted and revealed the extent of their concern. Export controls were dramatically tightened. Nations purchasing MiG-21s now received aircraft only with Soviet pilots permanently stationed at the bases where the fighters operated. Soviet advisors who had previously maintained oversight of maintenance and training now exercised direct operational control to prevent future defections. The Iraqi Air Force was purged of Christian pilots and others whose loyalty Soviet advisors questioned. Trust in Allied air forces had been shattered by Operation Diamond's success. Munir Redfa's fate remained classified until the 1980s, when Israeli intelligence judged that Cold War tensions had relaxed enough to acknowledge his role publicly. Redfa had been given a new identity and lived quietly in Israel, working as a civilian instructor and technical consultant. He never regretted his decision to defect. In interviews conducted during the 1980s and 1990s, Redfa explained that Operation Diamond had given him the opportunity to live without discrimination, to provide his family with security, and to contribute to a cause he believed was more just than the regime he had served in Iraq. He died in 1998, honored by Israel as a contributor to national security, whose courage had changed the balance of air power in the Middle East. The Soviet Union attempted to address the MiG-21's exposed weaknesses with the development of the MiG-23, a larger fighter with improved range, better low-altitude performance, and more sophisticated weapons systems. But the intelligence damage from Operation Diamond was permanent. American pilots had been training against actual MiG-21 aircraft for more than 20 years by the time the Cold War ended. Entire generations of fighter pilots completed their careers having practiced air combat maneuvering against the Soviet fighter that Moscow had believed was secure from Western intelligence. The technology gap that Operation Diamond exposed wasn't simply that American fighters were superior to Soviet designs, though the testing had confirmed significant American advantages. The deeper revelation was that Soviet export models were inferior to American fighters in ways that Soviet propaganda never acknowledged. The MiG-21 wasn't the revolutionary aircraft that Soviet marketing claimed. It was a capable fighter with specific strengths and serious weaknesses. American intelligence had acquired the data to prove those weaknesses quantitatively, rather than relying on pilot reports from combat encounters, where adrenaline and confusion made objective assessment difficult. The captured MiG-21 remained at American testing facilities through the 1980s, serving as the foundation for aggressor programs that became standard training for USAF and Navy fighter pilots. The U.S. Navy's Top Gun program, established at Naval Air Station Miramar in 1969, incorporated lessons learned from the MiG-21 testing into curriculum that transformed American naval aviation combat effectiveness. Air Force Weapons School developed parallel programs using the captured aircraft and later acquired Soviet fighters to provide realistic adversary training. Soviet confidence that their export controls would keep MiG-21 secrets safe had proven catastrophically misplaced. Every nation that purchased MiG-21s after 1966 became suspect in Soviet eyes. Could other pilots be recruited? Had other aircraft been compromised? The paranoia that Operation Diamond generated within Soviet military intelligence created rifts with allied nations who resented the implication that their pilots couldn't be trusted. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and other MiG-21 operators found themselves subjected to increased Soviet oversight that sometimes approached occupation rather than advisory support. The MiG-21 remained in service with various nations into the 2020s, a testament to the aircraft's basic soundness as a design. But every nation that flew MiG-21s after 1966 did so knowing that American and NATO forces understood the aircraft, its capabilities and limitations as thoroughly as the pilots who flew them. The psychological advantage this knowledge provided American forces was incalculable. Facing an opponent whose strengths and weaknesses you understand completely is fundamentally different from facing an unknown threat where propaganda and reality are impossible to separate. Israeli intelligence demonstrated through Operation Diamond that Mossad and CIA cooperation could achieve results that neither agency could accomplish independently. The operation required Israeli intelligence skills in recruitment and family extraction, combined with American technical analysis and testing capabilities. Neither agency alone could have executed Operation Diamond successfully. Together, they proved that intelligence cooperation between allies could compromise Soviet military secrets that Moscow considered secure. The legacy of Operation Diamond extended far beyond the single MiG-21 that Munir Redfa delivered to Israel in 1966. The operation established principles of aggressor training that became fundamental to American fighter pilot development. The intelligence gained about Soviet design philosophy informed American aircraft development for decades. The psychological impact on Soviet military planning created doubts about security that influenced every subsequent technology export decision. And the demonstration that determined intelligence services could acquire Soviet military hardware through recruitment rather than combat fundamentally changed how both sides approached operational security. The Soviet Union had exported the MiG-21 to 15 nations by 1966, confident that strict security protocols and the severe consequences of defection would keep their technology secure. CIA and Israeli Mossad proved that the best intelligence is none acquired through satellite photography or electronic intercepts. It's obtained by convincing a pilot to deliver the aircraft personally, complete with documentation and detailed explanations of every capability and limitation. The technology gap that mattered most in the Cold War wasn't just American fighters versus Soviet fighters. It was American intelligence successfully acquiring Soviet fighters, testing them exhaustively, and developing tactics that transformed the balance of air power through knowledge rather than through superior engineering alone. Iraq had trained Munir Redfa to fly their most advanced fighter, believing his skill would protect their airspace. The Soviet Union had sold that fighter to Iraq, believing their security protocols would prevent compromise. Instead, Redfa delivered the MiG-21 to Israel. Israel shared it with the United States, and American intelligence transformed Soviet military secrets into tactical advantages that saved countless pilot lives over Vietnam and beyond. The shock that reverberated through Soviet military intelligence when they realized what had happened revealed a truth that Moscow had never wanted to acknowledge. In the intelligence war, determined adversaries with skilled operatives could compromise any system, acquire any technology, and exploit any human weakness to achieve objectives that military force alone could never accomplish.